Okay, so I'm very happy to chair the first panel, The Future of Nuclear Deterrence, Global Trends. We have three excellent speakers for this panel. And our first speaker is Professor Yair Evron. He's a member, of course, of the arms control team at INSS. And I think Yair is probably, was the teacher of everyone in Israel that deals with arms control. I think everybody has taken Yair Evron's courses on nuclear strategy and arms control. He established the graduate program in security studies at Tel Aviv University and headed it from 1994 to 98. He's taught at Sussex University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Harvard, UCLA, Cornell, Georgetown, you name it. He's taught there. He's published extensively, of course, on international politics, strategic affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, nuclear proliferation, arms control, and international security regimes. And he will address us this afternoon on the topic of adjusting to a multipolar nuclear reality. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. What I'll try to do today is sort of an introduction, actually, to the conference, because I'll raise some issues and several points and some thoughts about the nature of nuclear weapons in the current international system. But obviously, much more would be debated and elaborated during the conference itself. Now, in the title of my lecture relates to a multipolar system. I would hasten to correct myself, because it seems to me that the current international system is not... 20 minutes. Is not a pure multipolar system. Actually, it's a mix of unipolarity and multipolarity, to use these terrible jargonistic words from the jargon of international relations. On the one hand, or not on the one hand, but obviously the United States, to repeat the obvious, obviously the United States is still the center of the international system. And I would argue, not I myself, but it is generally accepted, at least by one school of thought in the international security studies, that it is preferable, or it's good that the United States still plays a central role in the international system in terms of world order and the rest of it. On the other hand, there has emerged, obviously, clearly, a group of medium and the big powers that are enjoying quite a lot of influence in the international system. Obviously, China is, of course, the first candidate. Russia is still an important power. There are several additional, India, Brazil, and all the rest of it. In addition, I think a contribution to the multipolarity of the system is that regional issues are more important, or have become much more important, in the overall recipe of international events, in the overall world of international interactions in today's system. And to a certain extent, immediately I would hasten to say these new powers, first of all China, of course, that can compete or be competing and might reach the same economic power of the United States within a few years, these new powers still play primarily a regional role and do not aspire and don't have the capability of playing a global role, of replacing the United States or even standing with it in terms of influence over global issues. They remain primarily as regional powers acting in their immediate neighborhoods. even China. So we have of several features of unipolarity and several features of multipolarity, what I think Sam Huntington once called unimultipolarity, to use these jargonistic words, jargonistic terms. Just to repeat, what are the three main pillars of American power? Obviously, the economic and technological power. Secondly, military advantage. I think that the United States still plays the most important, still the most important player in terms of military capabilities, both in terms of defense budgets and in terms of the combination of nuclear and conventional capabilities. And thirdly, because of the whole system of defense alliances, which allows the United States, both its immediate capabilities and the defense alliances, allows the United States a quote-unquote rich capability to all the corners, in military terms, to all the corners of the international system. Thirdly, of course, is soft power, and I think soft power is important in terms that the ideology of the United States, well, not the ideology, but the system of values and the ideological commitments of the United States attract many more states in the international system than alternative and competing values and ideological considerations. So it seems to me that these three basic pillars of power allows the United States to continue to play the central role, the main axis of the international system and of world order. Now, what I'm trying to do now is, incidentally, saying all that, one has to bear in mind obvious constraints. For instance, American public opinion, that is now, because of the heritage, the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan, are not inclined towards the use of American military force in what is called boots on the ground, major land campaigns in different parts of the world. But I think American public opinion will accept the use of surgical operations by the United States all around the world in defense of American interests, and also, I would argue, in defense or in cooperation with allies. Let me turn to the main topic of this conference, or one of the main topics, and that is the role of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence within the context of this new complex system of unipolarity and multipolarity. And I think there are three main issues that one has to consider in terms of the role of nuclear weapons. First of all, contribution to strategic stability. Secondly, the relationship between conventional and nuclear capabilities, military capabilities. And thirdly, the military dimension. To what extent nuclear weapons contribute to the achievement, the implementation of political objectives within the spectrum of the interest of a state. Now, if we look back at bipolarity, at the period of bipolarity, one has to accept that nuclear weapons contributed, well, even the main or one of the main elements that contributed to international strategic stability. There are major historical debates about the contribution of nuclear weapons to peace in Europe, peace in the world, to stability between the United States and the Soviet Union, between the Warsaw Pact and the NATO. Nevertheless, it seems to me quite obvious, quite clear, that nuclear weapons played an important role, a very important role, in the stability of the nuclear relationship, in the stability of the strategic relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Saying that, one must hasten to add, contrary, for instance, to to the arguments of Kenneth Waltz and the whole school of thought that he is leading, that this contribution to strategic stability, and I am referring to that because I'll go on to the current system, international system, this achievement of strategic stability through the existence of nuclear weapons was the result of a long process of gradual socialization and learning throughout major crises between the United States and the Soviet Union about the nature of nuclear weapons, and also through a whole system of arms control agreements, confidence building measures, and all the rest of it between the United States and the Soviet Union. All that together was a very important context within which nuclear weapons contributed to international stability during the Cold War. Now, if we look at the present time, at the current system, one has to look at to what extent nuclear weapons contributes to strategic stability today. I shall divide between two levels. First of all, the American role in the international system and the ability of the United States to not to force, but to contribute to international stability on the global level. The second level would be relationship within different regions under conditions of nuclear proliferation. These are the two main areas to which I am looking. I would argue that at present day, although nuclear weapons still play an important role, I believe, and might play or would play similarly an important role in the future in achieving nuclear stability, in achieving strategic stability, it seems to me that there is a shift to conventional capabilities as an important factor in contribution to international stability, both on the global level and also within regions, but primarily on the global level. It seems to me that the United States, with its conventional capabilities, is much more able to impose or to contribute to strategic stability. So this is the first point. The change in the relative contribution to strategic stability of nuclear and conventional capabilities. Another observation has to do with the relationship between nuclear weapons and the implementation or achievement of political objectives. Here again, I would argue that already during bipolarity, the ability to use nuclear weapons in order to achieve political gains was quite limited, contrary to widespread beliefs. It seems to me that today, again, conventional capabilities are much more important in terms of translating force and capabilities to the achievement of political objectives. So there is a change in the balance between nuclear weapons and conventional capabilities in terms of achievement of political objectives. Let me say a few words about the American role in the international system, about nuclear weapons in that role, about the overall credibility of American deterrence. First of all, contrary to the predictions of doom about the decline of American power, it seems to me that American power is still, or the use or deterrence, American deterrence, or the ability of the United States to achieve political gains or to achieve political targets in the relations between states in the international system, not within states, and I'll come back to it in a minute. It seems to me the American power is still very credible and capable of achieving these objectives. It seems to me that there is a misunderstanding about the ability of the United States to use power in the international system in order to achieve political gains. The United States is very constrained and unable, it seems to me, to change domestic situations or the political structures within a state. I think attempts in that direction are futile and have proven already to be futile. It seems to me the ability of the United States to play an important role between states, using also the threat of military power, is still central, important, and quite credible. Because of the limitation of time, I'll hasten myself. First of all, it seems to me that the importance of defense alliances of the United States, I think they are very important. I think the United States has to contribute to the reassurance of allies throughout the international system. I think this is an important factor and pillar of American power and therefore also of international order. I spent some time on the American role in the international system and how it is still, it seems to me, quite very credible based on the pillars of power of the United States. I'll say something about regions and nuclear deterrence relationships within regions, and also end by saying something about, as an example, of the Israeli new assumed nuclear capability as an example of to what extent nuclear weapons contribute to deterrence and to the achievement of political objectives. First of all, about the possibility of regional nuclear relationships within different regions. In fact, we have basically two examples. The Indian subcontinent, and to a certain extent the Middle East, although in the Middle East still only Israel has a nuclear monopoly, but what might happen if Iran becomes a nuclear power? The situation in Northeast Asia, the North Korean situation, is partly a regional issue and partly part of the global strategic relationships. The main point I wanted to stress is that not similar to the situation during bipolarity and the Cold War, and this is a major debate within different schools of thought, nuclear proliferation in different regions will not necessarily by itself, the introduction of nuclear weapons into different regions would not by itself stabilize strategic relationships, as at least one school of thought would argue in the body of literature on international security issues. I expect many different points of possible crisis and escalation that might escalate to the nuclear level under situations of proliferation in different regions. But of course we have a panel on the Indian-Pakistani issue, and we can learn more about that and also about the Middle East situation. I would add a slight corrective on that. It seems to me that in the region, in the Indian subcontinent, in the Middle East, if Iran becomes a nuclear power or another country becomes a nuclear power, on the first level of analysis, nuclear weapons would contribute to stability because decision makers are rational, basically. Iranian decision makers are also rational. And rational decision makers will not jump into moves that might lead to a nuclear escalation, might lead to mutual destruction, mutual annihilation. The problem, of course, is the situation of crisis and the absence of the whole body that I referred to beforehand when discussing bipolarity and the Cold War of measures that contributed to stability around the nuclear capability of the two superpowers. This is absent both in the Indian subcontinent and in the Middle East. So on a first level of analysis, it seems to me that one should not jump to the conclusion that once nuclear weapons hit a certain region, it might immediately, or not immediately, it might lead necessarily to a military confrontation, to a possible potential nuclear confrontation. But if it happens, the introduction of nuclear weapons, one must bear in mind the necessity, in order to avoid such a nuclear crisis, the necessity of many measures, many coincidental and contextual measures that aim at limiting the danger of a nuclear escalation. Finally, because of time limitation, I would say something about Israel. After all, the conference in Israel, and I myself devoted part of my time to thinking about the nuclear situation in Israel. And I belong to, I think, a minority school that would argue that when one looks at the long period of time when Israel presumably had a nuclear capability, overall, the Israeli nuclear capability did not contribute to Israeli deterrence. It is not that it is not an important factor. I think that in the past and today, the Israeli nuclear capability is one component in the overall range of Israeli deterrence. But it seems to me that conventional capabilities were and still are much more important than the nuclear component in the Israeli arsenal. Similarly, contrary to the argument of a strong school of thought both in Israel and in the world, the Israeli nuclear capability, assumed nuclear capability, did not contribute to the achievement of political objectives. One of the main arguments, I remember I researched it back already in the 60s, one of the main arguments in favor of introducing a nuclear capability to Israel was that, once Israel had such a capability, it would help Israel to impose, to reach a peace agreement with its neighbors. In fact, if one looks at the history of the Middle Eastern conflict, of the Israeli-Arab conflict, one must reach the conclusion that Israeli nuclear capability was not an important factor in the achievement of peace settlements that eventually took place between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan. Thank you very much.